Yeah, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation here to this festival. I would like to first introduce ourselves. So you see here Marko Ciciliani, who is just rescuing me for the technical stuff. He is a composer and audiovisual artist, professor for computer music, composition and sound design at the Kunstuniversität Graz in Austria. And he works at the IEM, the Institute of Electronic Music and Acoustics. And my name is Barbara Lüneburg. I'm an internationally performing violinist in the field mainly of contemporary music and multimedia art. I'm also artistic researcher, and in that context, I started composing as well. I hold a professorship for artistic research at the Anton Bruckner Private University in Linz, also Austria. And there I'm also the director of the academic and artistic doctoral program. And today we would like to give you some insights in the artistic research project GAP, Gamified Audiovisual Performance and Performance Practice. And I hand over to Marco.
But we will go a bit further than that, because what we wanted to present to you today is, first of all, how we ended up doing our research in games and what it has made to us. So we would also like to give you a glimpse of the following research, what it has triggered in Barbara and also in me. Fields that at first sight might seem very unrelated, but of course there is always a connection. And so what we will present within the next 40 or 50 minutes is going to be a mix of different areas of interest. However, we're going to start with a little performance. It's a piece which I composed already in 2014. It's a piece with the title Formula -1. And it's one of my first pieces where I tried to quite explicitly work with elements in the context of musical composition, which then 2 years later became the main research question of a larger research project, which we will then tell you more about. So just give me 1 minute to get everything ready, and then we can kick it off.
Switch off the lights.
Oh yes, right.
We'll send you running again afterwards. Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So this was in 2014 when I composed this piece. And in 2012, in fact, I was performing at a festival. And just by coincidence, two other performers the same night worked with game elements in the performances. They were completely unrelated. It was really a coincidence. And I found this extremely fascinating. At that time, I knew absolutely nothing about games, but it had a very immediate impact on me, especially in terms of a sort of liveness which came across. So I could see that the performers were acting according to rules which I didn't understand. But what was very evident for me was that there was this very strong involvement and interaction happening. And from that moment on, I thought, well, this is really a very interesting field that I should better look at. However, at the same time, I felt extremely intimidated because, as I said, I knew nothing about games. I was not a kid that was raised with games. However, I had this strong feeling that if I ignore this, I'm going to miss something which might be important for me. And so gradually I started to include elements from games in my compositions. And the more I looked into it, the more I thought this really has a very, very large musical potential in the sense that there are many different ways that you can extract from games that can really become musically meaningful. And in order to understand this better and be better able to apply it, I thought it would be really ideal to have a larger project funded where I can work on this question with a team of researchers. So I started writing applications, and eventually I was lucky, and we got funding for a 3-year research project in the field of artistic research, which was eventually extended to 5 years. And that project started in 2016, and we finished in 21.
I was based, so there was GAP, obviously, GAP, Gamified Audiovisual Performance and Performance Practice. And the project was based at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Graz, Austria. And as Marko said, it was funded by the Austrian Science Fund as a so-called PIG project, a program for the development of and extension of the arts. It's actually for artistic research. In GAP, we have applied elements from computer games in the context of experimental audiovisual concert works like you saw just now in Formula -1. And it was all done within artistic research. I think most of you probably know what it is, but I still would like to shed a few words on artistic research because that's the core and how it relates to this project. So to us, artistic research is research that is grounded in the artwork and in the artistic process itself. And research questions and methods arise from the art and arise from the knowledge and experience of the artist and feed back into them. Artistic research very, very often is interdisciplinary, but you really have to know it's fundamentally research for the arts and through the arts and using the means of the arts. So the whole process of doing art was really at the core of GAP. And it was of fundamental importance that we employed our own artistic practice, that is composing in the case of Marko and performing, and in my case as the central focus. Over the course of the project, a whole body of works was created. In the end, it encompassed almost 20 artworks, 9 academic papers, and various software applications.
I think we can skip that.
Whoops, yeah.
We already covered that. So the core question of the research was as simple as this: what is the artistic potential of elements from computer games in the context of experimental audiovisual composition? And we developed a special research design for this. And what lay at the core of it was that we also organized various, how did we call them?
Work labs,
yes.
Yeah.
And we commissioned artists to compose new works for those work labs. The work labs are usually 5 days where we locked ourselves up in a studio at the university, and we invited various other artists also, or researchers, to join us in the observations and in the whole process. And what we were doing during those 5 days is basically we just rehearsed the new pieces. But during those rehearsals, we
developed the new pieces. It was not only rehearsing, but it was all, for example, all composers or audiovisual artists which we invited as guests, they came usually twice. Like they came for the first spring work lab, and then they brought along sketches and the first rough idea or draft of the work they were doing, and then we rehearsed it and we commented on it, and so they had a whole group of people just staring at them and saying, maybe if you would change this or that, then maybe that would be more obvious, and they could say, oh, yes or no. And then in the second work lab in autumn, they would come with a fully developed piece, and we would test it with an audience in a concert.
So the 5 days were quite a dynamic process. As Barbara mentioned, we actively still adjusted features of the compositions, but then we also had in the evenings little sessions where we just sat together and discussed everything, all these exciting things that we experienced during the day. And we finally finished those work labs with a public or semi-public concert, I should say. We had an invited audience of 30 people. Roughly, and then we performed the pieces for them. And we asked the audience members to fill in quite elaborate questionnaires because we wanted to get as good as possible an idea of how they perceive those pieces. And
okay.
with some of them we also conducted interviews, so maybe skip ahead to the next, this one.
Yeah, okay.
Because we wanted to observe those pieces from 3 distinct perspectives. Barbara already mentioned that one was kind of my perspective from the composition, her perspective as a performer. But then we had a third person on our team, Andreas Birchner. He's a designer and a musicologist, and he was responsible for the audience part, for the development of the questionnaires and especially of evaluating that. This was particularly important for us because of course, for us, everything was so crystal clear what's going on in those pieces, the rules, the goals, the criteria, etc. And what becomes very hard to judge is how somebody perceives it from the outside who has absolutely no prior knowledge of what's going on. And this is why the audience perspective was important for us.
It was also very, very interesting for us because usually you don't get that. But I had the feeling that the people who came to our lab concerts were really serious about I will tell them the truth. And so we sat there, we had these focus group interviews, for example, and Marko and I were sitting really in front of them and we got such critical feedback partly. And we thought, okay. But it was super interesting because sometimes you really can't judge anymore how the audience perceives something. You just assume something, and then you see an audience is not composed out of, I mean, we all know that, but still somehow we assume that they think they more or less feel it the same way, but it can be really, really different depending on the context where they come from, depending on their mood, depending on, I don't know what, and or how they just perceive the piece, you know. And so we got really perspectives on what we were doing and could really incorporate that into our research and into our reflection of the works which were done. The same applied to performance. Some of the pieces were just solo performances, then we just asked the solo performers. But some of them were done in a group, and even in a group, the impression of how of what such a piece feels like, what the agency is in it for a composer, for a performer, sorry, can be felt really, really differently. So I think that was these questionnaires, the interviews we did, also the interviews with the composers about their intentions, it was super fruitful.
As we mentioned earlier, altogether almost 20 new pieces have been created as part of the research. So every time when we commissioned a composer to develop a new piece, we sort of looked at a pool of research questions that we had. I showed you only the primary research question, but we had like a whole pool of secondary research questions. So every piece that was composed was targeted towards a particular area of interest which was relevant for the research. Maybe we can just play a little excerpt of a piece by Christoph Ressi to give you an impression of some of the other works that were created.
Oops, sorry, no.
that is running in the background, I would just like to explain a few details about this piece. So Christoph has designed a 2D platformer game in sort of retro aesthetics. And basically what's going on is that the clarinetist, Silat Benesh, he can control the movement of this little avatar by the position of the clarinet. And the whole environment is a sort of open world design. So here you can visit a graveyard, or in a moment he'll enter a hospital. And there are no particular rules or goals how he has to proceed, but every environment offers a set of different sonic options, which are usually triggered by different objects or NPRs that he can interact with. And
maybe I can take over
yes,
from a performance point of view. What is really interesting is he has what's called this space of possibilities, in which how he can act. He has an environment in which he can wander around. He can take drugs. He can move his little avatar. He can work with what he hears. I mean, there's a lot triggered. A lot of samples, audio samples, are triggered by him and within the game. But he also adds his own audio, of course, and that's all improvised. And what he has to do while he is playing this game is also taking the audience along with him, so that the audience doesn't get bored, and so that the audience does understand what is he actually doing, how does it work, and it's not only for his own pleasure that he's playing at the stage, but it's really also for the pleasure of the audience, and it's something which he shares. He shares the audio, he shares the visual with them, and so partly he's in this game set, and partly he's in a concert set, thinking all the time about the overall form of the piece and how it projects towards the audience.
So this is just an impression of one other piece, so there are many others, and this eventually also led us to develop a set of different methods, for example, how we can compare the different pieces, because at a certain point we suddenly realized, oh my God, we got already like a dozen pieces, and how can we really compare them? And so part of this whole research project was also the development of certain methods and how to get a grip on the whole material, all the data that we have been accumulating. So to finish off GAP, I would like to tell you in a bit more detail about the last project which I realized as part of this research project, which was a bit more elaborate. The title is Anna and Marie, and it's a combination of concert work and an installation. And in a way, this also, the reason why I would like to talk about this in a bit more detail is because this also sort of pointed me to a direction which I've been following since, which is a sort of hybrid between a concert and an installation and all the possibilities that this offers. So,
I think we can have a look first at the video. Would you like that, or? Oh, okay, no.
Well, maybe just a few words about the background, and then I can play a little example. So this was a commission by the Donau-Eschinger Musiktage, which is a 3-day festival or 4 days in the south of Germany. And so we had the possibility to use a room for the entire period. And so that's where the installation was happening. But as part of the installation, we also performed a total of 8 different performances in this piece. And what was underlying the whole project was this idea of a serious game, you could say. I wanted to dig into a very specific historic topic, which I found interesting, and this is based on Anna Morandi and Marie Vicheron. These were 2 artists and scientists living in the 18th century, and both of them were specialized in ceroplastics, so the modeling of wax sculptures for medical purposes. both were real masters in the craft, and both had partly the same commissioners, like Katharina the Great was collecting objects from both of them. However, what I found really interesting is that apparently they never met. One of them, Anna Morandi, lived in Bologna, Marie Vicheron in Paris. Even in the 18th century, these were distance that could be overcome. So I found it kind of peculiar that they apparently never met. So what I did in this piece was a sort of speculative storytelling, you could say. I tried to imagine what could have happened if they would have met. And so I developed this sort of story, how they got in touch with each other, and then my whole pieces is about their first meeting in person. So they were at first pen friends, and then finally Anna went to Paris to meet Marie. And so there are different stories that can unfold. There are always junction points, and then the story can unfold in one way or another. And some of the paths are longer than others. Some are even recursive, so they can become quite elaborate. And the performances of this piece, so this story is basically told during the performance, and the performance is for two violins. Barbara again on the electric violin, and Susanne Scholz was playing a Baroque violin. And those performances vary between 15 to 45 minutes, depending on what path they choose. And I was a little bit in a dilemma. I really wanted to tell a story, but I wanted to avoid to have the sort of typical radio play effect, because often when you hear music with voice on top, the music becomes a sort of accompaniment. And in order to avoid that, I wanted to offer the story as an optional thing. And I distributed in the performance space 20 of those little headphones. And during the performance, the violinists were triggering dialogues between Anna and Marie, but the dialogues were not on loudspeakers. They were only on the headphones. So if you wanted to follow the story, you could just pick up one of those headphones and listen to the dialogues. And otherwise, if you just wanted to enjoy the event as a musical performance, you could do that as well.
And we as performers had actually two kind of scores. We had this one score which you see here at the iPad, which we were given a scope of microtonally, like say, bended or colored pitches, which we could improvise on while following playing instructions, but they were really subtle playing instructions, which we had developed during the rehearsal process. And while we would play, we would also listen back to the story, which was played back into our ears. And we could always follow the storyline. We would know when do I have to trigger the next fragment of speech. And because we could follow the storyline, we also knew how long our phrases had to be and when it would come to an end, or how to continue, or is this a question, or whatsoever. And but this was only part of the score, and for me, actually, the essential score was projected on two beamers,
Video screens.
Video screens. Yeah, each of us had one video screen, and the video screen represented an image of one of the anatomists, lying image, and slightly. How would you say that?
It was like a sort of topology, a landscape that you could walk through.
And and to me, this game landscape was actually the even more important score, because that I had to navigate, and I could collect trophies, and I could decide over the continuation of the different strands of the underlying story when I went to certain junction points. Our mode of playing was tracked by the computer, and change of playing volume, for example, was translated into how fast we moved through the landscape. staying on one pitch for a certain time allowed us to enter a different playing mode in which we could turn left or right or left or by changing our pitch. And for example, when we came to one of the lakes in the landscape, we had the option to drain the lake, and once we had drained the lake, then one of the wax figures, in the case of one of the anatomists, she was specialized in embryos. And the other one was specialized in wax figures of the eye or the heart, of organs, you know. And you would see this then appear on this landscape, and the audience would see this appear on the landscape. And part of our task was to make it, to really show it to the audience. So find an angle where they could really see all this whole line of embryos, or they could go along with us on this landscape and wonder what would happen next. So yeah, so we had an audio task, we had a visual task, and we had a storytelling task, you could say.
I'm just going to play a little excerpt to give you an impression. So this is a concert version. I'll just skip ahead a little bit. This is now, you will hear the text, but keep in mind that the text was actually only on those on those headphones, not on the loudspeakers.
I have never seen a more beautiful wax sculpture than yours. The wax looks soft like human tissue, and it's as lively as if blood was running through its veins.
Oh, you are exaggerating.
No, I'm serious. I don't know how to achieve such a quality.
I'll skip ahead a bit. At a certain point, the players would arrive at such a shimmering object, and this would always occur once they come to such a junction point in the story. And here they could choose how the story continues.
So if we turned left within this junction point, that meant that we would trigger the really harmonious storyline in which the two women will develop a really beautiful friendship. And going straight means it's totally neutral. Turning right means the further development of the story will lead to conflict and drama between the two women, and you never know what's going to happen then.
So there was a large range of different outcomes between close friendship and complete fallouts. And that eventually led to a sonic state which you could say was sort of suspended and which then formed a sort of starting point for the installation. And I'll just let this run in the background to save some time. This is how then eventually the same environment became accessible for audience members. So it's still the same place. You could still pick up those headphones, but now the last story that has been generated was just running in a loop. But so you could sort of re-listen to what was happening. You could also pick up tablets and trigger some augmented reality. And here then 3D objects emerged, but also texts, and those texts provided some sort of background information of the times that they were living in. So this was actually historically accurate information. By that, I just wanted to offer sort of additional entry points to understand what the context is of the whole story. You could also now navigate yourself through these environments. And so what I was, from an artistic point of view, what I found interesting here is to give the audience a set of different options, how they can engage with this piece. You could also just sit down on one of those cushions in the space and just enjoy the environment, or you could become more active. Same in the concert, you could just listen to the performance or follow the story. And so you could say that this whole environment for me was a sort of zone of encounter, how the audience gets in contact with this particular work. And this is something what has since fascinated me quite a lot. So maybe some of you also saw my performance last night, Rave Seance, which for me is also a sort of particular situation, how I want to offer a particular encounter for the audience, how they can engage with the work. And so both, in very different ways, both of these works, you could say, are hybrids between an installation and performance.
Okay. So I think there's quite a bit already about Anna Marie, and we would like to go now into a different theoretical background, and which is connected to Marko's artistic research field.
Actually, I think we should jump ahead to yours, because
Okay.
I don't think it's so important to elaborate more on that.
Okay. So how does gap tie into my research in instrumental performance studies? I was educated as a classical violin player, so I played Tchaikovsky, Brahms, Mozart, and things like that. Later, I ventured into contemporary music and did all the weird stuff. But still, games and classical music, it's still quite far ahead, far apart from each other. So can you? This got lost.
We're skipping this.
Yeah.
And here you.
Okay, but in my artistic research, there are maybe 3 keywords which emerge again and again and again. One is creativity, because I'm really interested in the creative potential of performers, not only in contemporary music, but also in classical music. And agency, performative agency and creative agency. The creative agency is something which becomes more and more and more important for performers nowadays, especially in contemporary music. What composers have done already for a long time, that they say, I'm a composer-performer, is now switching, that the performers say, okay, now we are going back to what we did in historical music practice. We are going back to being a performer-composer. So this creative agency which we have is something which became more and more important to me and also to other players. But I'm also interested in the performative agency. And being a performer, I'm really interested in my relation with the audience. So these are key aspects of my work. And in GAP, it was really important to me to understand what is the role of the performer in these pieces, how is my or other people's performance influenced by the game aspects in these audiovisual works. I already talked a little bit about the space of possibility, which is actually a term which we got from the game theories. And we define it as the space of all possible actions and meanings that can emerge in the course of the gamified artwork. And this concept ties together for us meaning, design systems, and interactivity. We have goals and objectives to fulfill in these game-based artworks. We have got various forms of agency. As I said, the creative agency, which was really obvious in Anna and Marie, how I use the projected space, what kind of pitch material I use, how I influence the storytelling, and so on and so on. And but it also, this agency also concerns the real world, how I behave on stage in the concert space, plus the virtual world I'm in, what is happening also for the audience, what do I project to the audience. So we say that the performers in GAP shape the game, the artwork, and the art situation at the same time, and they have to create an artistically engaging concert experience for the audience. And if I now go to the next slide, which has many, many words, but it's almost always almost the same. So my first step into artistic research was my PhD research at Brunel University. That was the first time that I really looked at the creative potential of performance practice in contemporary music. And I investigated the audience-performer relation by looking at concert aura and charisma, but I also was looking at collaboration with composers. What was my share in the creative development? What was the composer's share in the creative development? And that means I really wanted to establish at that time what is the creative and performative agency I have. And this is something which stayed with me in parts, I think in every single research project which I did afterwards. These are core aspects of which I'm looking for. The next big project I had was transcoding from hybrid art to participatory culture, social media art research. There I try to connect with an audience online via social media, and I wanted them to participate in the creation of an artwork. So they would send me material. They could also decide on what really interests them, when would they react to offers we made them, and how would this, what does this mean for the power relation composer audience, for example? How does the creativity of the composer has to change when we really invite an audience to participate in the creation? And with participating in the creation, I don't mean just to trigger something, or I don't know, do something on your iPad or iPhone, but really send us material, say this is interesting to us, this is not interesting to us, send us music, they send us text, they send us images, and they were all incorporated in an artwork. And every time when I incorporated something, I asked back to the audience member and asked, okay, is that something how you would like your music, your text, your image be presented? So it was about participatory art and, again, audience-performer relation, getting to know what is really in the minds, in the interest of the people out there. Then we had GAP. We already talked about GAP. And now I'm at my most recent, in the middle of or at the beginning of my most recent research project, which is called Embodying Expression, Gender, Charisma, Breaking Boundaries of Classical Instrumental Practices. Here, when you think about charisma, you always have to think about the audience, because the audience is the factor who says, you are charismatic to me or you are not. So it's always something about the relation audience-performer. And embodiment is something which I haven't investigated in my PhD research. When I was there looking at charisma, I was looking at really different factors that play into charisma, but not the body, because at that time I think I was not able yet to really research what is happening on stage when you use your body, when you are standing. What is it? How does your facial expression or the movement or your body, what does it convey to the audience beyond the actual musical playing? So this is something which is very new to me at the moment, and very, very exciting. And here I go back to my roots. I really go back to classical music, and I'm really investigating what is happening there on stage. Another aspect which is interesting to me is gender, and in a way I connect again to Formula -1, because in Formula -1 you really wanted to have a female player playing Formula 1.
Also Anna and Marie.
And Anna and Marie, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but again, I have a slightly different perspective on that. So this is how GAP, in a way, ties into research interest of mine, which has had really different ways and aspects and a multitude of perspectives which I want to investigate. And I think here we're more or less at the end, unless you want to add something.
No, thank you. I would just like to point out at the end of GAP, we published a book which is a sort of summary of our entire research. It's a 400-page book. It's actually 2 books in one. And it also has a DVD stick with more than 4 hours of material that we documented, various performances. So if you're interested, we are offering a 25% discount in 25% in comparison to the publisher. And yeah, I think, or I hope we have a couple of minutes for Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for the glimpse into your workshop. Yes, are there questions from the audience?
For the Anna and Marie performance, how did you prepare for that? Did you meet with the other violinist and practice? And
yeah, we could more or less only practice that when we're together as a team with Marko on the other violinist. Of course, we had to prepare the pitches a little bit and to work with the pitches and get acquainted to that, like working with a certain scale. And the Baroque player, she actually prepared her instrument with frets, which was really a good idea, I think. And it was also a question of how to, well, we had to do different things. We really had to learn how to play with a score, which was projected, but we also had to learn how does our instrument react to the tracking, which was much easier for me because the electronic violin is really smooth, and the Baroque violin has lots and lots of overtones and is much harsher in ways, and so it's really difficult to handle. And this is something we could only learn when we were together and when we had the electronics and we worked together. And yeah, it was a lot of team negotiation, trying out, preparing that, and a lot of nice work.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very inspiring presentation. I have a very elementary question, maybe, concerning the formats, the actual outcome of your artistic research. So these examples we just had that you presented, these hybrid formats, you see a screen or a projection and performance acting. And this somehow seems to, this is my question actually, is this somehow now the standard format for this sort of research and its outcome, or are there other possibilities of interaction between virtuality and actual performing?
Well, can I answer to this? I should have mentioned this in the beginning, but the main focus was indeed works with a sort of concert setting, meaning that we work with a stage, with performers, and an audience that is more passive than the performers on stage. And so here a sort of hypothesis that we started out with was this idea of the backseat player, that watching other people perform can also be an interesting and meaningful experience for an audience, which in game culture is of course very common with all those YouTube channels where people just watch others play. However, during the research project, we also developed a number of pieces which offered some sort of varying degrees of audience involvement, where some installation-like works where actually the audience became the performer, where there were no other performers involved. But I have to say that this was the exception. And the focus was definitely more on this sort of, stage performer audience setting.
But that was a question of our research design.
That was the research design, yes. Since you mentioned the word outcome, the outcome is very varied. So, of course, we have this whole collection of works as practical applications of the research that we have collected. But as I mentioned earlier, we developed a number of methods that we could also apply in our research, which can also, in my opinion, be adopted and applied in other fields. So this is a sort of more academic tool set, you could say. And Andreas Pirchner, our third person on the team, he also developed a special app for measuring audience attention, which is an app which has in the meantime also been used in other contexts. So the outcome is
and we wrote
diverse.
articles. We wrote really proper academic articles. But you could also use the research catalog, for example, if you wanted to point, or if you wanted to connect text with documentation of the artistic process or artworks. That's all possible.
Yeah, sure, I know that. Your outcome is actually not unknown. But yes, I was referring really to the
To this
performative,
project. Okay.
situation of the project. Yeah, thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your fascinating work. I have a quick question, which is for the non-fiction parts that you've integrated, for example, in Anna and Marie. I apologize if I've missed it, but your team seems to have been very interdisciplinary. Were there also historic anthropologists to digest some of the material, or other disciplines involved?
I'm not sure if I understood. If there were also other historic
You're
investments?
also using non-fiction parts
Yes,
that
yes.
you integrate and from which you built a story. For those non-fiction parts and the choice of those, were, for example, historic anthropologists also part of the team?
No, I did this all myself just by reading books and researching on the internet. But it was a combination of this fictional and non-fictional. So the non-fictional part was part of the augmented reality, where you could trigger different texts and, for example, read about the relationship of anatomy. What's the word of dissecting bodies?
Dissection? Sorry? Not for. Is it called forensics when it is really?
It's not so important, but there were some very interesting frictions with the Pope, for example, with how the church related to the treatment of dead bodies, which was in high demand in medicine at that time. And so these were kind of interesting background informations that had an impact on the professional lives of Anna and Marie.
But the speculative storytelling which you used in this artwork was not built on reality.
No, the encounter was pure fiction.
Yeah.
But according to the circumstances, an encounter would have been possible, but didn't happen. So I wanted to correct that.
There was a question.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. I had a question about the YouTube gaming videos you mentioned. I think it's always interesting, perhaps why people watch those, in that they, I think, tend to have an understanding of what the game is that they're watching. You know, in the same way that we might watch sport, kind of we understand perhaps how football works. So when we watch it, we have an understanding of what players are doing. And I suppose my question is then, to what extent is the sort of mystery involved in watching something unfold that you don't understand, if it's a new piece with new rules that makes perhaps no sense to begin with, versus perhaps the way that the audience is introduced to that, the sort of self-evident nature of it. So you can watch it and go, okay, I understand what's going on, and therefore I can kind of participate and get a different appreciation of what the performance is. I'm just curious about the way you see that balance, really.
Do I understand correctly? Your question is about the transparency of what's going on?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that was a big issue. And it's something that we actually deliberately used in very different ways. So we had pieces where we deliberately hid everything. We made it like the most extreme example is a piece where if you don't know that it's using game principles, you wouldn't even recognize it. That's the game element has been used to create a particular relationship between the performers, which which then sort of bleeds into a musical quality of performance, but it was absolutely not in the foreground. So there, the game is completely hidden and non-transparent. And then we had other works where it was with 3D environments where you could also see, like in written words, what is the next mission, what do the players have to accomplish. So in those cases, we try to make it very obvious. But this is something that came up again and again and again. And
maybe I could say also, we didn't find an answer to that. We really didn't find an answer because it also, or we did find the answer that it depends on so many other things, because it's not only the game which is represented. And when we had our test audience, for example, they all knew that it was about this research project, and they expected to find game elements. And if these game elements were obscure, then there was like what? This is outrageous. I couldn't find anything, and what are you doing to me, you know? Or they were speculating this could be part of the game, this couldn't be. But this is also some kind of music which sometimes people fall for it, and sometimes they really don't like it. And even if we think, oh, this is really, really great or really obvious, like with a piece of Christoph Ressi, which we saw in the beginning, which had so many, which would allude so much to well-known pieces, still there could be people who said, okay, this is just too aggressive and so complicated and they wouldn't concentrate on the game anymore. So what we found is that it is really complex and it needs more investigation, and we invite all of you to continue our work.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think there was a question in front.
Thank you very much for this interesting glimpse in your artistic research. I also have a question about this work lab format. I think that's really an interesting format, and especially about the focus group interviews. What was the outcome of these interviews that really helped you? Because often it can happen that the critic that comes back just flies over your head as a creator and think, yeah, that's not. But what was really the things you could grasp and work with and brought you forward?
That's a very good question. I think you can answer that better than I.
I think that the focus group interviews would not offer us tools to improve something, but it would make us much more aware of that what we expect the audience to perceive is really not granted. And you could say, okay, if you know, okay, somehow we also come back into this area of charisma again, because charisma really depends on the value of the person who is listening or watching you. And then you have to meet these values and maybe break them a tiny little bit. This is one of the theories of charisma. And then you appear charismatic to this person because you're sort of a leader. But seeing you sitting here all, I think you come with at least one shared value or one shared interest, that is games. But otherwise, you come from really different backgrounds. So I think if we from this focus group interview, and we specifically for the focus group interviews, we specifically tried to question an audience which came from different backgrounds, different age groups, and this was something we were really looking into, that we invited, because this was an invited audience, and so the way how we could profit from that is learn more about the different audience members, different values they bring into the concert. And I don't know how the composers, or for me it was, as a performer, it was interesting to see what really reached them, what part of my performance and what part of how I conveyed the visual or the audio aspect. And I don't know how the composers reacted to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I think the performer interviews were often very interesting because we had a number of pieces also with more than one performer. And then we also always conducted interviews with the performers after the concert. And it was interesting to see how different also their judgment was. So even if they played, for example, in a string quartet, every individual member of the string quartet had sometimes really a different experience of the pieces. And I think that was, well, I think all those interviews, that's a little bit too simplified, but one of the most important things in a way was to learn how different things can be read and experienced.
Yeah. So I think what we are doing, or how we are approaching this, is really with a constructivist worldview, that we just want to understand the world we are surrounded with. Sorry, yeah. And in this kind of research, it's usually you don't get really a tool set that you can say, okay, if I do this, then I will succeed. Yay! That's not gonna happen.
We will slowly have to move to the next slot. Is there anything really urgent or fast to explain? Then we can take one more question.
Super urgent. And my presentation afterwards will be kind of short, so we'll have enough time. But I was wondering about the storytelling and performance aspect, because I imagine with the playing a story-driven game, usually the first time I play it is the most engaging. Then maybe I play it again to kind of see the different story ends. But I imagine after some time with maybe practicing it, the play aspect kind of gets smaller and the performance is more important. Maybe you could say something about that, how it changed for you over time.
Well, I always found it really lovely to listen to the voices because they had this really beautiful accent. So I think in that case, I was really the classical instrumental player. I can play Mozart sonata or Bach sonata so many times, and I find all these beautiful details, and I'm just going more and more and more into it. And I think with the text it was the same. So it never got boring for me, and that was partly because of I like the story, and I like the voices, and I don't know if we ever explored all the different strands that were possible. So every time we did it, it was a little bit new.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, for the performance also, and thank you very much for the lively discussion.
Thank you.